Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here to share how Azure Arc can help solve some of the challenges you face in your IT environment today. As many of you embrace a hybrid and multi-cloud strategy and increasingly take advantage of edge computing, your IT environments are changing. With many different types of resources, Linux and Windows virtual machines, SQL Server, Kubernetes clusters running across distributed locations, your own data centers, hoster data centers, in different public clouds and at edge locations, managing and securing resources at scale can be a challenging task. In building Azure, we face similar challenges. Azure itself must manage many different resources, compute, storage, network, across a global footprint of regions and data centers. That is why we built the Azure Resource Manager, to be Azure's control plane. Azure Resource Manager coordinates the lifecycle of operations of resources. Azure Resource Manager is also extensible, enabling Azure services to easily and consistently benefit from those foundation capabilities. Today, the Azure Resource Manager manages millions of resources on a daily basis from over 200 services running globally. With Azure Arc, we're extending Azure Resource Manager to any infrastructure. This provides customers with consistent management, governance, and security at scale, regardless of where their resources are running. It works the same way, whether they're trying to take care of an existing server or build a new container-based application. As Julia mentioned, we are thrilled to announce the preview of Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server, expanding Azure Arc server management to Microsoft SQL servers running either physically or virtually. You can now view a full inventory of SQL servers on premises or in other public clouds from the Azure portal and apply Azure Policy and Security Center capabilities to your hybrid data estate. Because we're using the same control plane for both our public cloud and hybrid scenarios, Azure services can be brought outside of Azure regions. Customers can build and run applications consistently across infrastructure in traditional branch offices and data centers, on edge locations like the factory floor, or in another public cloud. But enough talk. Let's take a look at the Azure Resource Manager and Azure Arc in action. Let me set some context. Tailwind Traders is an example company that has workloads in multiple clouds and data centers in over 300 locations worldwide. The sprawl is causing them to struggle to keep their infrastructure secure, compliant, and up to date. It's also forcing them to put off deploying new applications to move the business forward. So let's look at how Azure and Azure Arc can help them take care of their existing investments and building towards the future. I'm logged into an IT management view for Tailwind Traders, and here you can see all the servers in the subscription. This really is all the servers. Windows servers, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, CentOS, Ubuntu, and SUSE machines, running both directly in Azure, as you can see here, but also being managed from Azure via Azure Arc. And the machines that are being managed via Azure Arc were onboarded by installing Azure Arc on the physical or virtual server where it resides. Azure Arc then connects to a service in Azure that integrates the resource into the Azure Resource Manager, the control plane, enabling Tailwinds to manage all their resources from Azure. Now, once Azure knows about the resource, a wealth of functionality is unlocked because they're treated like native Azure resources. Azure Arc extends key control plane functionality like resource groups, RBAC, audit, and more to any infrastructure. Last week, we also released VM extensions for Arc-enabled servers, which lets you deploy extensions at scale using Azure Policy and ARM templates from Azure. Using extensions, you can easily onboard your on-premises servers at scale to Azure management services like Azure Monitor, Azure Security Center, update management, change tracking, and more. Let's drill down into a specific server running Windows Server 2012 and SQL Server. One of the most powerful Azure features that Tailwind is adopting is Azure Policy, so they can manage resources, track compliance status, and set guardrails for their internal customers. These policies are built into Azure, and Tailwind can apply policy to their servers centrally and at scale. Now, have you ever had a certificate expire at an inopportune time? Well, this policy is built to handle the problem. It shows audit results from Windows VMs that contain certificates expiring within 60 days. As you can see, Tailwinds applied this policy to a resource group, and this server inherited the policy by virtue of being in that resource group. When working across all of these different environments, seemingly simple things can be incredibly difficult, like knowing which cost centers to associate which resource with. Tailwinds can use tags to help. Here you can see this server has been tagged as a production SQL server. It's been assigned to a cost center and marked as a migration candidate. Now, because this server is treated as an Azure native resource, it's easy to enable additional Azure services and features. For example, with the Azure Resource Graph Explorer, we can build powerful queries to manage our servers. This is a simple query that checks for tags on servers that aren't in Azure. And here you can see that same server we were just looking at. Tailwinds is also taking advantage of Azure Security Center. And with the new addition of Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server, they can now use advanced data security capabilities like vulnerability assessment and advanced threat protection to improve the security posture for their data workloads anywhere. Here we have an Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server instance under protection from Azure Security Center. You can see a summary of the recommendations and alerts for this instance and drill into individual items for further exploration and troubleshooting. For example, Tailwind traders can drill down to their vulnerability assessment list and see recommendations into vulnerability findings like misconfigurations, excessive permissions, unprotected sensitive data, and so on across the hybrid data estate. They can also benefit from advanced threat protection capability and get alerts on any attempts like brute force. They will have details on when the attempt happened, the attacker IP, and so on, so they can quickly detect and remediate threats for their SQL Server outside of Azure. Even better, Tailwind traders can upload those security alerts to Azure Sentinel for further investigation that allows security teams to track down those threats with intelligence. Azure Arc Server Management is already in public preview, and by expanding to any SQL Server, it brings unmatched security from Azure Security Center to data workloads across your hybrid estate. You can get started solving real problems you have today by managing increasing system sprawl with Azure. Now, everything we've seen so far shows how Tailwinds can extend Azure management to existing resources without considerable investment. What about Tailwind's challenge around deploying new applications to drive the business forward? Earlier, I mentioned that they have over 300 retail locations with different hardware, and they want to standardize on that one new cloud application that is deployed in the same way across all of their stores. Let's take a look at how Azure Arc can enable the new application and database deployments at scale with Azure SQL database running on Azure Arc managed Kubernetes clusters across the globe. With Azure Arc, Tailwinds can deploy Azure Data Services to Kubernetes clusters in each location, which you'll hear more about later from Rohan. They can also manage and deploy the applications to clusters and manage the clusters themselves. For their new cloud application, Tailwinds has decided to use Azure Data Services, but they need the data to stay within each store. With Azure Arc, Tailwinds can deploy Azure SQL Managed Instance directly from Azure to their local stores. Here you can see all the Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes clusters that they can deploy to. These are each Kubernetes clusters running outside of Microsoft facilities. Azure Arc supports many Kubernetes distributions, but we've worked closely with Red Hat, Rancher, and Canonical to ensure a great experience. What is really amazing is that the developers can create custom Azure policies to bind each Kubernetes cluster to their GitHub repository. That means that Tailwind traders can deploy both their application and their databases at scale simply by updating source control. Let's switch to one of the retail stores. If we look at the configuration, we can see the policy has been applied, which installed the new application, and everything is compliant. Just like with servers and Kubernetes clusters, Tailwinds can also see all the newly deployed SQL database managed instances for each store. The reality for Tailwind and many of our customers is that hybrid is a durable and long-term state. Workloads will need to run in many different environments, and we can use cloud technology to simplify deployment and management of those workloads wherever they are.